Okay, guys, I'm so glad y'all are with me today. Oh, we're at 20. Wonderful. So we're going to get started. Today is, our social studies day. And I always like to get started and review what we did last week, my anchor chart. And then we'll go into what our new lesson will be for today. Okay. So last week, my anchor chart, civil rights movement. We started with the civil rights movement. Civil rights is a time in history when African Americans were fighting for equality and equal rights. Segregation or separation of blacks and whites, it was legal, okay? And those were called the Jim Crow laws. So things that were segregated were all public places like parks, restaurants, movies, buses, anything that was public, even the restrooms. Schools were also segregated, and neighborhoods, they were also segregated. Now, some important people that we're going to talk about during the civil rights movement: Dr. King, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Thurgood Marshall, and some important events: the Montgomery Bus boycott. We're going to look into
so you don't hear me. I'm kind of sorry.
We're gonna please mute your devices. Thank you. The Montgomery Bus boycott. Dr. King he actually did the "I Have a Dream" speech, the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act. We touched on a couple of those things last week, but I do have a PowerPoint that we're going to go over today so that we can touch on them again and in depth. Now, another flip chart that I have today is our fight for justice. The fight for integration, that's ending segregation, keeping things separate, was very difficult but worthwhile. Many events and people inspired the cause. So some things that happened, and we're going to look at that today. There were a lot of protests, marches, a lot of boycotts, sit-ins. Okay, and those sit-ins were specifically like sitting in restaurants, because African Americans actually could not go, or blacks could not go in certain restaurants or certain places. So what they would do, they would go and sit at the counter, and so that the people there, even though they were being refused service, they would sit there. Even though they were being tortured, they would still continue to sit there. And that was also another movement. Because they wanted to be served just like everyone else. And one of the first restaurants that actually did the sit-in was Woolworth's restaurant. And I think that's actually in the PowerPoint today. There were a lot of speeches by important people like Dr. King, a lot of political leaders. And that's what they did. They actually did speeches and rallies to kind of get the cause out there and get people to see how important this cause was. Also, Freedom Riders. And Freedom Riders were just a group of people that mainly started in the North, but actually would ride buses to actually protest. And all of this these were all peaceful things that they did. But of course, they were tortured by just other average people, policemen. But it was a great cause that a lot of them did. So we're going to look into a lot of that in depth. The March on Washington was when Dr. King did his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the Lincoln Memorial. And that was reported to have like over 200,000 people there, guys, when he did that famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And I also put a link to the video of the "I Have a Dream" speech on our site. The day of the speech, the actual footage. The Montgomery Bus boycott, it was kind of sparked by Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks, actually, she refused to give her seat up on the bus, and she was arrested for that. And it actually sparked the whole Montgomery Bus boycott. Montgomery is in Alabama, and there the people refused to ride buses for over 365 days. So that means if they refused to ride buses, they had to walk to work, they had to walk to the grocery store, they had to do a lot of walking, catching, using church vans, actually riding bicycles. They did whatever they had to do to get to work, but they refused to get on the buses. And they did that over a year. And this actually started at the Brown versus Board of Education. And that kind of ended segregations in schools. That was with Linda Brown. But guys, as you know, that was very difficult. The Brown versus Board of Education. That was very difficult with the segregation of schools because there was still a lot of resistance in the South. And we're going to look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which the Civil Rights Act ended segregation and more equality and civil rights for all Americans, Black, white, but also more of the integration began during the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which we said was important last week because it ended the reading test that a lot of African Americans had to take to pass, to be able to vote, and ended the poll taxes. So that means the literacy test, which were the reading test, and poll taxes actually ended with the Voting Rights Act. Okay, now I'm going to share my screen and show a short video of civil rights. Okay, hopefully it is. Yes. Now, if the video does not come up, I want you guys to make sure y'all tell me, okay? If y'all can't hear it.
Nearly a century after the end of the Civil War and the dawn of Reconstruction, African Americans still found themselves fighting for their basic rights as citizens. The modern civil rights movement in the mid-20th century finally secured them.
Most historians actually date the start of the formal civil rights movement to Brown versus Board of Education. Brown really stokes the fervor of the nation. Then, in December of 1955, Rosa Parks decided as an act of resistance that she would not give up her seat to a white man on the bus.
Rosa Parks' deliberate act of resistance led to a bus boycott that thrust into the limelight a young preacher with a PhD. He would become one of the movement's most charismatic leaders. His name was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
One of the most iconic moments is the March on Washington in 1963, led by Martin Luther King Jr.
200,000 people converge on the nation's capital, rally for civil rights. They come united in one cause.
One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream.
This becomes visualized on the news and begins to change the way that Americans are starting to think about the civil rights movement.
As the civil rights movement attained greater visibility, it was often met with increased brutality and violence. Yet in the midst of so much sacrifice and heartbreak, the work of civil rights activists began to bear fruit.
In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 64, and that's designed to desegregate businesses and government employment. And then in 1965, President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act of 65.
The passage of the Voting Rights Act was a monumental victory for African Americans. Tragically, just 3 years after it was passed, Dr. King would be assassinated. Many feel, looking back, that the movement died that day. But in fact, the movement took on new forms and continued. And it must continue today, as important victories such as the Voting Rights Act are under attack.
Until we deal with the fact that the backlash is often made possible not just by the other side growing in power, but by those who claim to care about equality losing their own resolve. There will be moments of this cycle happening over and over again.
Oh, wow. Great video. Okay. Going to exit out of that video. And I'm going to stop the share. All right, guys. So were we able to see a lot of good things in that video that we've talked about so far? Were we able to see some things? And you will see it talked about Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson actually, after JFK was assassinated, John F. Kennedy, after he was assassinated, because he was the vice president, he actually became the president. So we know that he signed that Civil Rights Act, which actually was supposed to stop all of the injustice and actually make things more equal, even with the discrimination in public places, discriminations with jobs. So the purpose of the Civil Rights Act was, just like it says, civil and rights, so that everyone will be treated equally, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender, regardless of your nationality. So everything was supposed to be equal. And it also talked about the Voting Rights Act as well. Okay. Teachers, are there any questions or comments that you all would like to say so far? Anything? Okay. All right. Now, the next share that I would like to read from is the PowerPoint that I have. Okay, the civil rights movement. So with this PowerPoint, I'm going to look at a couple of slides. Now, I want you guys to be patient because the amount of slides, Ms. Anderson, are you able to see the PowerPoint that I have up now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, excellent. So we're going to look at the civil rights movement within this PowerPoint, guys, and it's a lot of good information that we're going to look at. And so it's going to be about maybe 8-9 minutes, okay? All right. The civil rights. African Americans were treated like second-class citizens. They were forced to live in segregated housing. Remember, we said the neighborhoods, the housing. They attended segregated movies, that's everything that was separate, and used segregated facilities such as the restrooms, water fountains, waiting rooms. Guys, even the waiting rooms in the hospital. So we take a lot of things for granted now that we have everything is integrated now. But a long time ago, during the Civil Rights Movement, things were separate. During the Civil Rights Movement, African Americans fought against racial discrimination and segregation. Schools. Schools were another place where blacks and whites were segregated. In 1954, Oliver Brown sued the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, because the schools were segregated. Now, remember that case, Brown versus Board of Education. Brown was the family, Oliver Brown and his wife, and the daughter's name was Linda Brown. So Brown, they sued, which was the Board of Education. So that's what the case was called, Brown versus Board of Education. His third grade daughter, Linda, had to travel 1 mile to get to her black school, even though the white schools were a lot closer.
Hello, Miss Dowdy.
Hey, Cordell, mute your computer, okay? Is that Cordell? Thank you. Now, here you will see where the segregation in the United States before Brown versus Board of Education. Look at all of that in the red. All of that is required segregation. And all of actually, you'll see all the states in the South, they were segregated. That's Linda Brown, and she's walking to school. Thurgood Marshall. Linda Brown's lawyer was Thurgood Marshall. He argued the case before the U.S. Supreme Court that having separate schools violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
Like one sound together, but you can still hear the S and the P.
Okay, make sure you mute your computers, please. Thank you. In 1967, Thurgood Marshall became the first African-American Supreme Court justice. Brown versus Board of Education. The U.S. Supreme Court heard the case Brown versus Board of Education. And in 1954, they ruled that students could no longer be segregated. The court said that segregation was illegal and public schools across America began to integrate. And you will look, that's the actual article that was in the paper. And the schools they were forced to start to integrate. The National Guard escorts 9 African-American students to their high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And that was actually called the Little Rock 9. And they had to be escorted, guys, by National Guards. Rosa Parks. In 1955, an African-American woman named Rosa Parks helped start the modern civil rights movement. After a long day of work, Parks refused to give up her seat on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama, to a white person. She was arrested and her actions set off many protests. Now, guys, this is sparking the Montgomery Bus boycott, okay? The previous event that we talked about was the Brown versus Board of Education. Now, this event is the Montgomery Bus boycott. That's Rosa Parks. She's on the bus. Montgomery Bus boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. led the protest and he urged people to boycott the buses. The Montgomery Bus boycott lasted for a year and the bus company lost a lot of money. The U.S. Supreme Court eventually outlawed segregation of all public transportation in the city. Look at the empty buses, guys. And the boycotters, they're walking to work. The buses were just totally empty after the boycott of African Americans as well. And it wasn't just African Americans, a lot of other people too, guys. And you will see even in the videos, if you look on our site, that a lot of people stood up for what was right. And it wasn't just Blacks, a lot of people did. Dr. King, as a result of the bus boycott, Martin Luther King Jr. became known across the nation as a leader of the civil rights movement. King preached nonviolent civil disobedience against unfair laws. He believed that African Americans could gain their rights by protesting, but that the protest should be peaceful. So that's another thing, guys. He was a nonviolent leader, okay? Nonviolent protest. African Americans and some whites held nonviolent marches and boycotts across the country. At times, the nonviolent actions from civil rights workers received violent reactions from white people. Some protesters were beaten, they were shot, and even killed. Guys, and if you will look at the bottom, that is an actual picture of a sit-in. And then you see the people were sitting at the counter and the people were actually pouring drinks and stuff on their heads. And that's an actual march that the police are actually arresting some of the marchers. So it did get very brutal and violent, guys. And if you will see, that's a dog attacking. And then sometimes even during the protests, the actual police would actually spray with those powerful water hoses, guys. So do you see, it was not easy and it was just a risk. It was a risk that everyone that was participating took to fight for justice. The March on Washington. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. led more than 250,000 people on a civil rights march in Washington, D.C. They called on President Kennedy and Congress to pass a law that guaranteed equal rights and quality education for all citizens. King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at that gathering. I'm gonna do just a couple of more slides, guys. And you see, that is at Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And guys, look at all of those people. Over 250,000 people were there. I have a dream, and this is just an excerpt from the speech. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And that means that your skin color or your race, that will not matter, but that your character matters, guys. The Civil Rights Act. The March on Washington got the government's attention, and Congress soon passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. This law banned, that means ended, discrimination against any American because of the person's race, color, or religion. The law enforced the desegregation of public places. That's just integration. So desegregation means it could not be separate anymore. It also said that people of all races, male and female, should have equal opportunity to get a job. And guys, this actually sparked the affirmative action. And what affirmative action means, that you cannot be discriminated from getting a job. And it was really for minority peoples, and not just blacks, Hispanics, any minority group. But that affirmative action said that the employer could not discriminate based on race. Okay, so it helped a lot of African American people that were qualified to get jobs to get jobs. And the Voting Rights Act, even though the 15th and the 19th Amendment had given African American men and women the right to vote, there were still voting problems in the South. Many states still use literacy tests to keep people from voting. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned all literacy tests. That means those reading tests, guys, it ended that. President Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr. were signing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in this picture, guys. You'll see Dr. King and you'll see the president. And we're gonna stop right there. Wow, a lot of good stuff we just read, guys. And you will also notice that that PowerPoint is on our class site, okay? Anything that you would like to share, Ms. Anderson, after viewing that? Anything that you would like to share? Ms. Anderson or Ms. Houseworth or Ms. Standard, anything?
I just would like to share that even though I have seen that the clips of that so many times and the pictures of the mall and the Lincoln Memorial, is still very powerful. Every time you see it, it's the same thing, the same emotion. It doesn't change how powerful it is to see that and those pictures and those images. And I'm so grateful that we have the pictures and images that were saved and archived, that so that students today are able to see that, because it's one thing to actually to talk about it in class, but to have those images and videos, it's so wonderful that they're able to make that connection with us, because they're very, very powerful, even to someone like me who's seen them many, many times. So I'm so glad that they were able to see those.
Yes, and even the Waterholes picture, it's just it always, when I teach it, it just does something to me, and it makes me a bit emotional every time. And I know what I'm watching, I know what this lesson is going to be about, but I still just get a bit emotional.
I agree.
Seeing how brave these people had to be. And I always step back and ask myself, could I have done that? Would I have done that? I would have wanted to, but would I have been brave enough to do that? So right. I always think that to myself, or would I have been scared? So I think it's just amazing to be able to jump into that time period just by looking at those pictures.
Especially when I thought of that when you see the ones with the people sitting at the counter, and people are pouring their sodas and their shakes and food over them, and they're just over their heads. And you notice that the individuals sitting at the counter, they're just sitting there. There's no pictures of them lashing out, turning around, yelling. They're sitting there calmly in that non-violent, non-cooperation, where they're not protesting. But think how you would feel if you had someone just pouring drinks or shakes or food over you over and over. And that probably went on for not just like a minute, but for a period of time. And that they just sat there and took that as their silent protest. That to me is very Oh, I don't know. That to me is very emotional to imagine that. It was not painful like a water hose, but to me, very emotionally painful to sit there and have that done to you, to have that poured over you, and just to sit there to take it in order to try to make something change.
Yes, and to make a statement. And how humiliating it is for someone to pour something over your head and you can't do anything about it. But you have to do it to make a change. And if they did not do all of the sit-ins, nothing would have changed in restaurants, nothing. And I can even remember as a little girl with my grandparents, and we would go into stores. As a little girl, African American, well, blacks, we weren't allowed to walk through the front door. We had to walk through the back door. And that was something that was new to me because my grandparents grew up that way. So they just naturally would walk through the back door, and I would get infuriated. I would just be furious, like, why? I mean, our money is spending just like theirs, but back when they were growing up, that was the law. And if they will refuse service if they walk through the front door. So many things that we are so blessed that people stood up and it made the laws change. It made views change. It made people's attitudes change. And it wasn't easy. But we are very blessed that they were brave enough to stand up. Ms. Houseworth, would you like to share anything? You're muted, Ms. Houseworth. Unmute your device.
Thank you. I was just going to tell the students that a lot of those pictures of those young adults were students, actually. Mm-hmm. And they have been actually trained and taught how to not to respond violently. They actually went through what you would call little sessions, and they would be taunted, and they would actually go through the exact same scenarios of the water and food being put on them and being pushed and things of that nature, so they wouldn't respond violently. And the Woolworth store actually is in Atlanta. Well, it's no longer there, but it was actually here in Atlanta, downtown Atlanta. And so you're right in the hub of where a lot of this took place during the civil rights movement, which Dr. Martin Luther King, right here in Atlanta. So what those individuals fought for were for your rights, which you have today. And we can't take it for granted. And so those young ladies and those students, Little Rock, Arkansas, sitting in and being brave enough to go in and to know that they were going to be treated differently, but they knew they had to do it. So understand that all of this that you're going over right now is so that history doesn't repeat itself, and that you can remember and understand that all students, all people are created equal, and that you all have the right to vote. You all have the right to the freedom of speech. You have a right, but at the same time, to remember to act in a nonviolent way and in a respectful way, and that's how the laws got a chance to be changed. Civil rights, the laws got a chance to be changed because people were able to assist people. It wasn't just one group of people, but it was a conglomerate of people of all nationalities wanting the same thing for one another.
Thank you, Ms. Houseworth. And Ms. Todman, would you like to share anything before we do our review game and end this thing up? You have to unmute your computer, unmute your device, Ms. Todman. Okay.
Just dropping in to say hi.
How are you?
I will be on more often, but just dropped in to say hello. And how is everyone doing?
Thank you so much, Ms. Todman. So good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you guys too.
Thank you. Okay, guys, so I'm going to review. We touched on a lot of important things today. We're gonna look more in depth. I want to just do an in-depth of Dr. King before we look at the assassinations on next week, but I want to do an in-depth because even after he was assassinated, his wife, his family, his legacy, it still lives on, guys. So I want to touch on Dr. King to just kind of break down and look at a lot of key things about him on next week, okay? So let's review. So we know today we looked at just some a PowerPoint over the fight for justice. The fight was very difficult, but very worthwhile. Many events that inspired the cause. We looked at protests, the peaceful protesters. We looked at marches today. We looked at some ways that they boycotted. We looked at a picture of the sit-in and all of the details. Just looking at those pictures there kind of made it come to life. We looked at the speeches, particularly the one on the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech. And we're going to also touch on Freedom Riders next week as well. So the March on Washington was by Dr. King at Lincoln Memorial, and that's where he gave the I Have a Dream speech. And actually that was televised, guys. That means on television, and it made the cause worldwide. Like nationwide is when, because of television, it allowed people in other states just to see what was going on in the South. So even the people like the Freedom Riders, a lot of the Freedom Riders were from the northern states where they didn't have a lot of issues like that we were in the South. And they were just blown away by it, and they wanted to fight for the cause of equality with African Americans. So the March on Washington, Montgomery Bus boycott, and we looked at the empty buses there because the African Americans were actually walking to work, carpooling to work. We looked at the Brown versus Board of Education and just the impact it had on schools, the family with Linda Brown, and then it actually sparked the integration of schools, and it started with the Little Rock 9, which those 9 students that had to be escorted by National Guard guys to school. We looked at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and we actually saw a picture of that they were signing it, and Dr. King was actually shaking the hand of our president at that time, Lyndon Johnson, after signing that. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, when that was signed, and it ended the literacy test and poll taxes. Okay, now what we're going to do, guys, I'm going to share one last thing, and we're going to play a little review game. Love games. And it's just a little matching game today, okay? Just a little matching game. And what I'm going to do is see if you can match up any of the vocabulary words. Yes. Okay, we're going to see if we can match up some of the words. Now, what I want to do is I'll call on you guys, okay? So let's look at some of our words here. We have the words are in blue, and the words are in blue, and the definitions are in pink. Are we able to see it, Miss Anderson?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, excellent. So we're going to go ahead and play the game. Cordell? All right, so let's look at the first one, okay? And I'm going to actually call on you guys to actually answer. Let's see, Emma. After I read the vocabulary words, I want you to do the first one, okay? So unmute your device. Okay, so we're going to look at the words. The words are freedom riders, civil disobedience, affirmative action, Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Montgomery Bus boycott, and Brown versus Board of Education. These are all of our words, okay? Excuse me. These are all of our words. Thank you. And our definitions: protected the rights of all citizens to vote. Programs that were set up to promote the hiring of minorities and women. Breaking unjust laws in order to shed unfavorable light on them as they are arrested. A tactic used during the civil rights movement that entailed not buying services until the Jim Crow laws were abandoned. inspirational leader of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks' courage started a boycott to overturn the Jim Crow law that said Black people had to go back to the back of the bus. Overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson for public education. Schools would now be integrated, and rode buses into the South in order to protest segregated bus terminals in the South. Okay, are you ready for the first one? Emma, which one can you match?
Martin Luther King and
Okay, Martin Luther King.
And protected the rights of all citizens to vote.
Okay, now, who was Dr. King? Dr. King was, which one of these definitions in pink do you think Dr. King was?
Inspirational leader of the civil rights movement.
Okay, inspirational leader of the civil rights. Yay, correct. Good job, Emma. Okay, let's see, Rylan. Hey, Rylan. Do you want to match one, Rylan?
Yes.
Okay,
please.
all right, Rylan. Which definition do you want to try first? Which word?
I'll do boycott.
Okay, boycott. Which one do you think a boycott is?
A tactic used during the civil rights movement.
That entailed not buying services until Jim Crow laws were abandoned. Let's see. Good job, Rylan. Excellent. Okay, let's see. Jackson. Jackson, would you like to do one?
Sure.
Okay, Jackson, what word would you like?
The civil rights
Act. Okay,
yes.
the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, what do you think? What did that do?
Breaking unjust laws in order to shed. Wait.
Now, you know, Jackson, it's between this one and which other one? It's at the top. So you're right. That looks like it could be a possibility. So it's either this one or which one, Jackson?
Protecting the rights to vote.
Okay, so now it's between these two. You're right. Now think of a Civil Rights Act. Which one do you think that it did? So you're right.
Protecting the rights of all citizens to vote.
Very good, Jackson. Now remember the Civil Rights Act, that's what it gave African Americans the right to vote. But the thing is, the Voting Rights Act that in the following year ended the reading test. Does that make sense, Jackson? So they got the right to vote with the Civil Rights Act, but they still had those reading tests and the poll taxes. But then the Voting Rights Act, a year later, stopped those tests. Very good. So the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act worked together, but it did more than just with voting rights. It actually, like any discrimination, that it tried to stop that as well. Good job, Jackson. Let's see. I want to call on a girl. Come on, Sid. Hey, Abby. I'll call on you next, Abby. Sydney.
I want to do the Brown versus the Board of Education.
Okay.
And that could be matched to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson for public education. Schools would be now integrated.
Very good. Integrated schools. That means stopping segregation. Good job. Let's see. I want to call on Abby and then I'll call on Nathan. Come on, Abby. Are you ready, Abby?
Yes. I'll
Okay.
choose Montgomery Bus boycott.
Okay. All right. Which one do you think? The Montgomery Bus boycott. Okay, think about it. What did the boycott do? Who was involved with the boycott? Abby?
Rosa Parks.
Okay, so which one?
Rosa Parks started a boycott to overturn the Jim Crow law that said Black people had to go to the back of.
Good job. Good job, Abby. And that is correct. Remember, it sparked that boycott once Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, and that
Can you hear
lasted
me?
365 days. Okay, Nathan.
Can you hear me?
Find one for me, Nathan. Which one would you like to do, Nathan?
Freedom Riders.
Okay, what do you think, Nathan? The Freedom Riders.
I think it's breaking unjust laws in order to shed unformal light on them as they were arrested.
Okay, so yes, sometimes the Freedom Riders were arrested. Well, let me click on that. Uh-oh, that's not the correct one. So let's try again. What did the Freedom Riders do? They rode on what, Nathan?
Rode buses into the South for the segregation bus terminals in the South.
Yes, they rode buses. They got on buses, and a lot of them came from the North, but they rode down to the South to fight for equality. Very good. Good job, Nathan. Quinn, find one for me.
Huh?
Can you find one, Quinn?
Yes.
Quinn?
Yes.
Okay, which one would you like to do? Quinn?
Civil rights disobedience.
Okay, which one do you think that is?
Breaking unjust laws in order to shed unformal light on them as they are arrested.
Very good. Some civil disobedience. Think of it, the sit-ins that they were doing, the marches, the protests, very good. But that was a way of them actually fighting laws that were not justice, that were not correct. They were not equal. Very good. And Zainier.
Hi.
Hi. Okay, Zainier, this affirmative action, can you read that definition for me, Zainier?
Affirmative action.
Yes, for affirmative action. Read that definition.
Program that were set up for promote the hiring of minority and women.
Very good. Now, good job, Zainier. Now, we know that affirmative action were just programs that were set up to hire minorities, which that's African Americans, Hispanic, any minority group, and women, that they could not be discriminated in the workforce. Okay? Good job, Zainier. Yay! Great job, guys. And this actual game will be on our site. All right. Well, guys, we actually did our lesson. We summarized. You guys did a great job. I'm very proud of you.